the overall approach to soils, activating soil biology for maximum self-fertility. So this concept of self-fertility, we're going to talk about it. The question is, how do I, in my own plot, work with ultimately a category, a compartment that will work for me all by itself? And I'll simply start with a photo. So what's interesting is that in these two photos, you have here a field and another field separated by simple paths. And so it's clear that in one plot, we could say Thomas's plot on the right and Pierre's plot here. On the left, we have two different outcomes. So I'll start with a question. I like questions. I like to ask you this question. Why? What do we observe? What is different here and how can you explain it? Why do these two plots, separated by just a simple path, have such a different effect on water infiltration capacity? Go ahead. I'm asking you. I'm sure some of you know the answer. Right? The soil is more compact here. Okay. What else? Yes, we can see crop residues on the right. That's true. What else can we say? Go ahead. We're all agricultural professionals here. You must have an opinion, surely. So indeed, on the left, we still have soil tillage. There was plowing, then a follow-up tillage, and indeed, on the right, there was only direct seeding. What else? Well, that's already quite a bit. So indeed, what we have here, it's actually quite remarkable what we can observe in these two photos is that here, a lot of energy was used to create soil structure. Soil structure is supposed to allow for better infiltration. It should enable a whole range of things. And yet, on the left, even though nothing was done, we have a soil that infiltrates better. And in the end, if we want to ask the right questions, I think it's important to do so when we observe this kind of thing in the field. That's the scientific approach asking these questions, even if we don't understand why. So in the end, what is it that gives us better infiltration on the left? Well, it's simply because there are things working for us. Here, we use carbon that we put into the tractor to create soil structure and to achieve better infiltration and so on. Here, we use that carbon, that fuel differently. And if we dig into this a bit, if we unravel all of this, here, this is another plot. First year of direct seeding with barley. And I walk through the plot and I notice this. Lots of little clumps like this gathering together. So these little clumps that are gathering together, if we get closer, if we take a closer look at them, they are those famous earthworm casts. So I won't ask you the question, but honestly, in the trainings I give, whether it's to technicians or farmers, it usually takes about a minute before someone tells me it's a living organism that does this. I've had all kinds of answers. I've heard wind, water, and soil tillage as answers. So actually there's a problem, which is that if we want to work with nature, we need to know how to observe it. We need to know how to make a proper diagnosis. And when you see a plot like this, dotted with earthworm casts, there were about 10 per square meter, the first diagnosis you make. When you know how earthworms work, is on this plot, there's no point in tilling the soil. So this farmer started his first year of direct seeding, and it worked out very well. And in fact, 10 years earlier, the plot was already in this condition because the farmer did till the soil, but he managed his cover crops very well and added a lot of organic matter, which resulted in interesting biological activity. We're dealing with a balanced clay limestone soil. So overall, we had a very good environment. When we do a spade test, we notice that the soil is roughly 60% fine earth. And when we look at the few aggregates, we can see that they're dotted with earthworm holes. So what I mean is that this ability to make a good biological assessment should lead us to make different decisions. And personally, I like to count. This farmer has 100 hectares of wheat and winter barley, crops that don't require an extraordinary soil structure. There's no point in exhausting yourself, constantly working the field for this type of crop. The cost of plowing, going over it again, the rotary harrow, labor costs, replacing one partslet, say, I'll estimate at least 120 euros per hectare, but honestly, that's an underestimate. That comes to 14,400 euros per year. Multiplied by 10 years, that's 144,000 euros in savings. He could have bought himself an apartment if someone had come to his field 10 years earlier and told him there's no point in working it, you could at least switch to direct seeding for your winter crops. So biological activity is an economic activity in its own right. It's not just something nice or pleasant. It's not just, oh, look, the earthworm is cute, I'm going fishing. It has a biological function. It has a real function in the soil. And that's what I'd like to get you to think about. I'd like you to reflect on what is at the root of soil fertility. So let's take a step back. Let's take a big step back, maybe too much for an agronomist, but I like it. We're going to travel millions of kilometers into space and look at that ball of fire, which is basically a luminous power plant with infinite energy on our scale. The sun is vibrational energy. And actually, when we practice agriculture or naturally, what does nature do? It performs photosynthesis and allows this vibrational energy to be transformed into chemical energy. It's the main process of living things. Without this process, we can't function, since chemical energy in the form of carbon is what allows us to move. It's our energy reserve. It serves many functions. And it's no coincidence that carbon is the most abundant element on Earth. And it's no coincidence that all life in terrestrial ecosystem is organized around photosynthesis. If you look at all terrestrial ecosystems, they're always covered. So actually, photosynthesis is a way that the environment has found to capture the sun's energy. It's the plant that is at the center of living and self-fertile systems. What does that mean? Let's be very factual. Basically, the plant captures energy, produces biomass, and then the plant ultimately recharges the soil with chemical energy thanks to a biotransformation factory. This biotransformation factory is right here. It's living organisms. It's your roots, your earthworms, your bacteria, your fungids are essential elements for understanding how the soil works. If you don't know how to understand the workings of living things, and if you don't know what's happening here with your earthworms, etc., in the end, you don't really know how our soil functions. So, well, I'm having some display issues here, but it's not a big deal. We'll manage. So in the end, it's very simple, what I call the resource habitat approach. So the resource is simply about feeding. As we've seen, the plant captures energy from the sun and then feeds this food chain in the soil, which has a number of functions. We'll see what they are. That's your organic matter. You have to keep one thing in mind. Carbon is energy, period. Whether you put it in the tractor or directly into the soil as biomass, it's still energy. In fact, we get energy from biomass, and it's part of the energy mix we try to use to power our homes and our cars. So next, we have habitat. Habitat means shelter, that is. You have to keep in mind that this soil is a living environment. And where does this biological activity live? Most of the time, it lives in the soil's porosity. So we'll need to pay attention to how this porosity is maintained over time and also to its quality. And then moisture and temperature and all the actions that affect the porosity, moisture, and temperature of the soil will inevitably also affect the living beings that inhabit it. So in the end, when we use this approach, this method of considering habitat as a resource, we're dealing with things that are relatively simple. I often say that in the end, working with soil life is like raising a dog or a cat. That is, if you don't give it anything to eat and you hit its kennel with a baseball bat every other morning, there's little chance your dog will be happy and content. So the central question is, how can you make your earthworm happy? So François and Conrad are going to talk to you about this quite a bit. But it's one of the key elements to think about when you're developing your cropping strategy. Roughly speaking, earthworms and microorganisms make up 90% of the biomass in the soil. So in the end, if you understand the earthworm, you can potentially, understand more or less if you know how to increase the number of earthworms in your soil. You will, as a knock-on effect, improve the entire food chain. So I would say the earthworm is a visible organism. It's easy to observe. It's easy to identify. This afternoon, Jean-François will show you different types of earthworms, and you will learn how to identify them. That's what you need to know how to do in order to be able to say, well, do I have enough biological activity or not? Obviously, there is the effect on crops, which is something to come and observe. So how do we feed them? I'm not sure if we should really talk about managing organic matter. Personally, I prefer to talk about managing the carbon flow. Organic matter in itself, it has its qualities and its drawbacks. We can characterize it by its C/N ratio. That's interesting because the C/N ratio tells us whether the organic matter has a lot of carbon or not. So you know how much carbon you're putting into the soil, how much energy you're putting into the soil. But the question is, how is it going to be digested and how is it going to function within the system as a whole? What's important is to consider one thing first. You have food carbon, all the plant biomass, all this energy carbon that will be available in your production system. That includes your crop residues, root turnover, and the organic matter you can add, such as, for example, ramial chipped wood, RCW, which is an organic material not often used, but which can actually speed up the process. If you apply manure with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 30, there's little chance that in 3 or 4 years, you'll have reactivated your soil. You need to use materials that are much higher in carbon. I'll let François talk about that a bit later. Then there's living and active carbon, which serves specific functions. An earthworm or bacterium is made of carbon, but it provides functions to the soilit, helps with humidification, mineralization, and also processes all this organic matter. And then there's liquid carbon, which we don't talk about enough. That's everything that is exuded from the roots. We talk about it far too little. In the end, it's actually one of the processes that accounts for 50% of carbon inputs. If you count the turnover of roots and the amount of soluble sugar that the root exudes in other words, the plant allocates part of its photosynthesis to feed communities of bacteria in the soil that may account for about 50% of carbon inputs. Why is this important? Because, in fact, the plant then, we'll see this in a moment, the processes of plant nutrition go through the soil. The soil is a plant's intestine. It's not just its support. If you look at how a root is shaped, it's like an inside-out intestine. So, in fact, the plant puts sugars into its intestines so that the microbiology can work the soil and allow the plant to feed itself afterwards. Obviously, you have your humus, which is a stock of carbon, so to speak, inert or more or less active, but which is worked on by the soil biology. So it's really the biology that enables these materials to be transformed into humus. When you put crop residue into the soil, it doesn't break down on its own. It's the biology that makes this happen. So having active biology is very important in order to be able to break down large amounts of carbon. And ultimately, carbon is the primary limiting factor for absorption. You can clearly see that in a soil with 1% organic matter, many functions are completely impaired. The question we need to ask is, from what threshold of carbon biological activity and carbon flows do I have a system that works or doesn't work? I don't have much time, so I'll move quickly through the rest. But basically, we consider that there are 3 main types of fertility. Ultimately, this chemical fertility that we talk about so much feeding my crops, for example, physical fertility having good soil structure don't really make sense if we don't take biological fertility into account. That is to say, in the end, chemical and physical fertility are simply an environment for this biological activity which we need to consider and manage. But if biological fertility isn't there to create chemical fertility, you'll end up adding fertilizer forever. And to achieve physical fertility, you'll be working the soil forever as well. So it's absolutely essential to work on this living, active carbon that allows you to have a self-fertile system. So with this approach, you'll ultimately have personally, I really like this holistic approach to soils. For me, it's about having a functional approach, meaning it gives you a framework to think about the production system. If you consider these 3 types of fertility, the ones we talk about most are chemical and physical fertility. All day long, that's what we hear about when we get advice or think about plant growth. But now we also need to take biological fertility into account. And for example, if I consider compaction and think about the effect it can have on my system, well, if I compact the soil, there will be less oxygen circulation and there will be less space for life to function. An earthworm is not a jackhammer. If there's a thick plow pen, it won't get through, especially when it comes back in the spring. The anesic earthworm nests deep in the soil and comes back up in the spring. If there's a thick plow pen, it won't work. It doesn't have enough energy to make its way back up properly, and it will die. That's why, for example, plowing is one of the techniques that kills the most anesic earthworms in the soil. Chemical fertility, of course, is driven by biological fertility. So if you have a negative impact on biological fertility, you won't have natural chemical fertility and you'll have to add fertilizer. Intensive soil tillage, no ground cover, what's going to happen? Well, the first main factor in soil sterilization is the sun. You can clearly see that when you leave something out in the sun, it gets sterilized. Bare soil is soil that will gradually become sterile, at least on the surface. It has no cover. We saw earlier that roots exude liquid carbon. We saw that organic matter is what nourishes this biological activity. So not having any cover and no active roots will also have a negative effect on this biological fertility. If I add to that the fact that there will be a lethal effect on a number of organisms, I need to question this logic of systematic soil tillage. It's necessary because otherwise there would be too much disturbance, too much stress. So we'll look at the strategies later with Conrad on how to set up a system where we don't need to till the soil and instead rely on this biological fertility, which should normally provide us with structure. I'm going to skip over the chemical fertility aspect. I don't have time. So what happens when we properly manage a soil in the end? We'll get there. So here, for example, is a practice that we can implement. I'd like to thank François for putting this practice in place because it was important to see it through to the end. That is, at some point, can I quickly restore this natural soil fertility? Can I do it or can I not? Here you have some photos. So on the left, you see alliums in mulch and you have tomatoes. Well, they look like normal tomatoes. I mean, it's as if we had used a cultivator, except that this soil hasn't been worked at all and we've only added straw. We made a massive initial addition of organic matter to quickly raise the organic matter content to 4 or 5%. And then we completely stopped working the soil. The biological fertility is restored so that afterwards, when you dig into this soil with a spade, the structure is honestly good for soil that hasn't seen a tool in years. So actually everything is in place for roots to grow without any problem because we have enough earthworms, because we have enough activity. Chemical fertility is improved. You just need to add carbon for it to release nitrogen. And you'll see these processes in the upcoming conferences. So this is how we enter a virtuous cycle of life. And since I have good chemical fertility, I can even regulate the base levels. That means, for example, the practice of systematic lambing, if I have an acidic soil, I might not need to do that as much if we regulate things through biology and carbon. Now, I'd like us to go back to the basics of plant nutrition, and that's important. Here you have a disinfected soil and a non-disinfected soil. We're not going to look at the other treatments. Those were mycorrhizae. It was done to show that mycorrhizae work. But just between a disinfected soil and a non-disinfected soil, with the same cover crop, the same seeding density, the same timing, and the same conditions, you get a biomass that is 4 to 5 times greater, simply because there is life in the soil. So here's the question I want to ask you. In the end, what is it that drives plant nutrition? Well, it could be fertilizer, but you can see that even when I add fertilizer, the plants grow less well than with just life in the soil. So life is the central processes activity in the rhizosphere and the interaction with microorganisms. We also need to consider the question of soil tillage. This is an interesting study because several soil tillage regimes were compared on the same plot of land. What do we notice? We notice that between plowing here and direct seeding done properly, there is over 10 more tons of living biomass per hectare. It's not just 1 more ton, it's over 10 more tons. The question we need to ask is whether here, when we've only doubled the initial biomass, which was very low, do we have enough to create a structuring effect on the soil and self-fertility? Probably not. So this question of the threshold is very important. If you look here, for example, this is the production of earthworm casts. Here, in this trial under a plowing system, we have 1.4 kilos. We have 11 kilos per square meter per year in a no-till system. When you look at what an earthworm cast is, it contains 5 times more available nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, 11 times more potassium, 11 times more magnesium, and 1.5 times more calcium. That means the earthworm makes these elements bioavailable for you. So if you put carbon into the soil, which will be broken down by the earthworm because the earthworm carries microorganisms, it's basically a walking intestine. It will provide the elements needed to feed your plant. But if you don't have enough carbon, the earthworm doesn't work, the microbiology doesn't work, and then you have to resort to fertilizers, tilling the soil to mineralize, and so on and so forth. We end up with absurd situations, like when I work in Spain, where there's only 0.3% organic matter in the soil, and I'm told, well, we're going to add bioinputs to mineralize the remaining organic matter. So at that point, there's no way out anymore. We're really at rock bottom. So it's very important to keep that in mind. It's biology that drives the fertility and nutrition of your plants. So what does a threshold mean? Let me give you a very practical tip. I know there are quite a few farmers in the room. Roughly speaking, you'll do a spade test during the active period, March, April, May, or September, October, when it's warm and humid. For me, the minimum level of biological activity is 4 adult earthworms. If you dig a spadeful and you don't find 4 adult earthworms, you have a problem with biological fertility. Good biological activity is 6 to 10 earthworms per spadeful. It may seem like a lot, but that's the question of the threshold. If I go from 250 kilos of earthworms per hectare to 300 kilos, I'm sure there won't be any biological effect. On the other hand, if I go from 250 kilos to 1.5 tons, then I start to have what's needed in terms of biological activity. That's the question we need to ask ourselves. It's not always about saying, hey, I added a bit of carbon, it cost me, and it didn't have any effect. Well, yes, that means at some point you have to see it through to the end. Soil biological fertility is like bodybuilding. That is, you go to the gym 2 or 3 times a week, you look at yourself in the mirror on Sunday, and nothing has changed. But if you keep doing that for 6 months, you'll have a bit more muscle. So it's the same thing, you have to go in the right direction for a long enough period. All right, I'll skip this part. It's about earthworm biology. Conrad will give you his talk, or François, that'll be just fine. We have presentations that are too long, but basically it takes 3 years to regenerate your earthworm population. So that's what you need to achieve. Basically, you have the casts that go over the straw, and that gives you your 5 centimeter seed bed. It's perfect, it's spot on, and that's what you should aim for. A quick question. This report, this resource habitat approach we've talked about, you need to make some observations. Here we have an agricultural landscape that isn't exaggerated. It's 95% of what you can find in cereal growing plains. I didn't make it up. We're really looking at something that's, let's say, typical. Are we following the resource habitat approach? Probably not, because unfortunately we don't have any ground cover, we don't have any carbon input, we don't have solar panels, and we have systematic soil tillage. Here we're in organic farming, we work a lot with organic matter, and there are some pretty good biological activities in organic agriculture, but we still have a lot of mechanical disturbances, and increasingly so. And if we don't manage our organic matter properly in organic farming, we can actually degrade the environment. You can end up with very problematic environments, even in organic farming. Here we're dealing with another type of agriculture, which we can now call living agriculture. Maximum ground cover, maximum biomass production, even in orchards. You see, in orchards we work with large cover crops, we've stopped making small lawns. And the idea behind this is to fully activate the biological cycle in order to reduce fertilizers and ultimately everything that costs us money. So the habitat is a soil that is always covered, never or very rarely tilled. The resource is maximum biomass. That's the mindset you need to have in all the systems you design. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means systematic cover crops, very minimal soil tillage, or ideally direct seeding. The resource is maximum biomass. You need to go cover crops that are productive. You need to return straw to the soil, add organic matter that's rich in carbon. In the future, Ramiol chipped wood RCW will become a carbon amendment that we'll need to manage. We can't always say that we'll have nitrogen deficiencies. If you bury RCW at a depth of 20 centimeters, you will have nitrogen deficiencies. If you apply RCW on the surface, you won't have nitrogen deficiencies. You should aim to return about 25 tons of dry matter per hectare per year to the soil to feed our biological activity once it's established. It doesn't work with just 1.5% organic matter. It works when you have 3, 4, or 5% organic matter. That's it. As an opening thought, I'd still like us all to reflect on this. Today, we have standard practices. It's complicated to change it, always complicated to change, but these are practices that deplete carbon stocks. If tomorrow we want to move toward bioclimatic agriculture, we need to shift to an agriculture, or agroecological, it's what you will, that stores carbon. So that means covering the soil, stopping tillage as much as possible, and starting to work differently with crop rotations. And that's what will allow us to build our future. We can't build that future alone. We're going to build it through a creative process that will necessarily and systematically include farmers. Farmers, I'm from a farming family myself. I've always seen my family innovate. It's the farmers who drive innovation. Advisors are there to provide structure, maybe to set benchmarks, but it's really the farmers who make things happen, and they're the ones we need to rely on. Thank you very much.